December 1942. The Kalach Steppe, west of Stalingrad. The horizon is a seamless, blinding white, blurred by a wind that carries the scent of frozen iron and cordite. In a shallow dugout carved into the permafrost, the air is thick with the smell of wet wool, tobacco, and the metallic tang of a kerosene heater. A 20-year-old Gefreiter sits on a crate, his breath blooming in rhythmic clouds. Around him, the muffled thump-crump of Soviet 120mm mortars provides a constant, low-frequency heartbeat to the wasteland. He is not looking through his trench periscope. His eyes are fixed on his own left foot. With shaking hands, he takes a thick, greasy cleaning rag and folds it several times, wrapping it meticulously around his boot. He knows the physics of the crime he is about to commit. He knows that if the muzzle is too close, the heat will sear the leather. If it is too far, the spread of the soot will betray him to the surgeons. He positions the barrel of his Mauser K98K. The steel is so cold it sticks to his skin. A single shot cracks through the dugout, muffled, lonely, and definitive. In the eyes of the High Command, this is not a wound. It is a self-mutilation, a betrayal of the Volksgemeinschaft. To the boy on the floor, it is the only way to hear a sound other than artillery, the sound of a train whistle heading west, toward home. This was the Heimatschuss, the home shot, a desperate gamble where the stakes were a hospital bed or a firing squad. To understand why a soldier would choose to shatter his own bone or blow a hole through his own palm, one must first understand the environment that produced him. The German Wehrmacht of 1939 was not merely a military organization. It was the physical manifestation of National Socialist ideology. From the moment a young man donned the field grey uniform, he was no longer an individual. He was a cell in a larger organism, bound by the Fahnenjunker, the sacred oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. The prevailing military culture of the time was built upon the concept of heart or hardness. Since the days of the Prussian reformers, the German soldier was expected to endure privations that would break lesser men. By the time the war entered its third year, this expectation had been codified into a brutal legal framework. Central to this was the decree of Wehrkraftzersetzung, the undermining of the military effort. This was not just a law against desertion, it was a sweeping catch-all mandate that criminalized any act, word, or physical state that might weaken the German will to fight. In the early, triumphant years of the Blitzkrieg, the phenomenon of self-mutilation was a rarity. In the summers of 1940 and 1941, morale was buoyed by rapid victories and the intoxicating belief in Germanic invincibility. When the Wehrmacht rolled through France and into the Soviet Union, the home shot was a whispered myth, something from the dark days of the Great War that surely would not happen in this new, glorious age. However, the German military code remained wary. The Kriegsgericht, or military court system, was integrated into every division. These were not objective halls of justice, but instruments of discipline. A soldier suspected of a self-inflicted wound was not treated as a patient. He was treated as a suspect. From the very beginning of the conflict, the German High Command maintained a database of suspicious wounds. They understood that in a total war, the greatest enemy of the state was not always across the wire. Sometimes it was the soldier's own survival instinct. As the war progressed, the definition of duty tightened. The state increasingly viewed the soldier's body as state property. To damage that property was an act of sabotage. This ideological pressure created a pressure cooker environment where the only honourable way out of the front line was through a grave or a verifiable enemy-inflicted wound that rendered the soldier useless for further combat. The landscape of the war shifted irrevocably as the autumn of 1941 bled into the most brutal winter in living memory. The invincibility of the German soldier was not just an ideological concept. It was a psychological shield that shattered against the reality of the Eastern Front. As the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees, the logistical failures of the Third Reich became lethal. Soldiers who had been promised a swift victory found themselves trapped in summer tunics, watching their comrades succumb to frostbite and typhus. This shift from a war of movement to a war of grinding attrition changed the nature of the soldiers' despair. In the vast, echoing silence of the Russian steppe, the psychological phenomenon known as Stellungsmania, or trench mania, began to take hold. The strategic concern for the Army High Command was no longer just about taking the next objective. It was about preventing the total evaporation of morale. They saw the home shot not as an isolated act of cowardice, but as a viral contagion. If one man escaped the meat grinder through a self-inflicted wound and succeeded, others would follow. By 1942, the military authorities began to notice a disturbing trend in the casualty reports. While thousands were falling to Soviet snipers and Stalin's organs, a growing percentage of wounds were occurring in the extremities, specifically the left hand and the left foot. These were the classic locations for Selbstverstümmelung. A hole in the left foot allowed a man to limp back to a field hospital while maintaining just enough mobility to eventually work a factory job back in the Reich. To counter this, the High Command deepened the build-up of internal surveillance. The medical services were reorganized into a front-line forensic force. Every surgeon was ordered to treat atypical wounds with extreme prejudice. A soldier arriving at a dressing station with a clean, close-range puncture wound was often met not with morphine and sympathy, but with an immediate interrogation by the Feldgendarmerie, the chained dogs of the military police. The major forces involved in this internal struggle were the soldiers' desperation versus the state's demand for total sacrifice. By the time the German Sixth Army was encircled at Stalingrad, the strategic concern had reached a fever pitch. Hitler's no-retreat orders meant that the only way off the battlefield was death, capture, or a wound severe enough to justify air evacuation. In the frozen ruins of the city, the home shot became the ultimate expression of the individual's rebellion against a regime that had already signed his death warrant. The stage was set for a forensic war between the wounded and the doctors, where the prize was life and the penalty was the rope. To understand the full scope of this shadow war within the Wehrmacht, we must look beyond the generic statistics and into the specific perspectives of those who lived it. For a German military surgeon, the arrival of a wounded soldier was often the start of a forensic investigation. The German Medical Corps was issued specific guidelines on how to identify a self-mutilation. The first thing a doctor looked for was the star-shaped entrance wound. When a rifle is pressed directly against the skin or thin fabric, the expanding gases from the propellant are forced into the subcutaneous tissue, causing the skin to burst outward in a characteristic radial pattern. Furthermore, the presence of soot and unburnt powder grains was a smoking gun. If a soldier claimed he was shot by a Soviet sniper from 200 meters away, but his skin showed the telltale tattooing of a point-blank discharge, his fate was sealed. Surgeons were trained to look for singed hair and the smell of burnt flesh, details that could not be faked even in the chaos of a field hospital. To avoid this, soldiers began using intermediaries, such as thick loaves of bread, heavy folded blankets, or even firing through a pot of soup to catch the debris and dissipate the heat. The medical officers, in turn, began analyzing the trajectory. A bullet that traveled perfectly vertically through a foot was almost certainly self-inflicted, as combat wounds typically followed horizontal or diagonal paths. What drove a man to do this? It was rarely a lack of patriotism in the early stages, but rather the breaking of the soul. Psychologists studying these cases post-war identified a state of reactive depression triggered by the sensory overload of the Eastern Front. A soldier who had spent weeks in a frozen foxhole reached a point where the fear of the firing squad was outweighed by the immediate need for the noise to stop. For many, the self-inflicted wound was a rational choice in an irrational world. They calculated that a prison sentence or a stay in a penal battalion offered a higher statistical chance of survival than staying in the front line for another 48 hours. The Soviet Red Army was well aware of the dipping morale in the German ranks. They used this knowledge as a weapon. Soviet propaganda leaflets dropped over German lines often contained instructions on how to fall ill or become unavailable for duty. Some leaflets even went as far as to suggest that a small wound to the hand would be the best Christmas gift a soldier could give his family. This created a secondary layer of suspicion for the German officers. Any man with a suspicious wound wasn't just a coward, he was potentially a victim of Bolshevik subversion. This increased the hostility of the interrogations, as the state sought to stomp out any sign that the enemy's psychological warfare was taking root. While the act of the home shot was an individual one, the ripples it sent through the German military hierarchy reveal the sheer desperation of the late war period. For those whose accidents were deemed suspicious but not conclusively proven as sabotage, the destination was often the Strafbataillon, the penal units like the infamous 999th Light Africa Division. Here, the home shot became a cruel irony. These men were stripped of their rank, their decorations, and their dignity. They were assigned the most lethal tasks, such as clearing minefields by hand under fire, or acting as cannon fodder to draw Soviet artillery positions. The regime's logic was simple. If a man was willing to damage his body to avoid the front, he would be forced to use that same body as a human shield for the honorable soldiers. Not every officer followed the brutal mandates of the high command. In the lower rungs of leadership, the platoon leaders and company commanders, a different moral crisis unfolded. These men lived in the mud with their soldiers. They knew who had reached their breaking point. To report a suspicious wound was often to sign a death warrant for a man the officer had known for years. Some veterans' accounts suggest a code of silence existed in certain seasoned units. An officer might adjust a report to say a soldier was hit by a stray splinter during an evening barrage, rather than admitting the man had shot himself in the dugout. This creates a shadow in the historical record. We will never know the true number of self-inflicted wounds because many were buried in the paperwork by sympathetic superiors who viewed the coward as a casualty of the mind. As the forensic skill of the doctors increased, so did the ingenuity of the soldiers. They realized that the standard 7.92mm Mauser round was too powerful. It caused massive exit wounds that were impossible to explain as random shrapnel. Soldiers began seeking out alternative methods. Captured Soviet pistols, like the Tokarev TT-33, were highly prized because their different caliber could be used to claim an enemy encounter while on sentry duty. Some soldiers went further, using localized infections. By injecting gasoline, milk, or even saliva into their joints, they could induce a massive inflammatory response. This was the silent self-mutilation. It left no gunpowder residue and no bullet path, only a fever and a limb that appeared to be rotting from a natural disease. This technological arms race between the soldiers' ingenuity and the military doctors' skepticism reached its peak in 1944. The state responded by issuing forensic field manuals that detailed how to differentiate between a bacterial infection and one induced by a syringe. The human body had become the final, most desperate battlefield of the war. As the calendar turned to 1943, the German military machine began to fracture under the weight of total war. Following the catastrophic surrender at Stalingrad, the psychological dam broke. The home shot was no longer a rare act of desperation. It became a localized epidemic. Between 1943 and 1944, as the Wehrmacht was forced into a series of agonizing retreats, the tension between the individual soldier and the military state reached its breaking point. The High Command, sensing a collapse in discipline, responded with a reign of terror. They deployed the military police in unprecedented numbers. These men became the most feared figures in the German rear. Their primary mission was to hunt deserters and those suspected of self-mutilation. They established sifting centres just behind the front lines. Any soldier walking with a limp or a bandaged hand who could not produce a signed wound tag from a frontline medic was immediately detained. The tension peaked during Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. As entire German army groups were annihilated, the desperation reached a fever pitch. In the chaos of the retreat, soldiers were no longer just shooting their feet. They were engaging in group sabotage. Small squads of men would agree to wound each other simultaneously, creating a combat narrative to support their stories. One man would fire a burst from a captured Soviet submachine gun into the legs of his comrades. Then they would return the favour, hoping the variety of wounds and the use of enemy calibers would provide plausible deniability. But the Nazi legal system was ahead of them. Chief of the High Command, Wilhelm Keitel, issued a blood order, stating that any wound that appeared geometrically improbable or occurred during a period of low combat activity was to be considered a capital offence. The burden of proof was shifted. The soldier was no longer innocent until proven guilty. He had to prove he had been shot by the enemy or face a summary drumhead court-martial. The decisive collapse occurred when the forensic war moved from the field hospital to the courtroom. By 1944, the military courts had been stripped of almost all procedural protections for the accused. The regime was no longer interested in justice, it was interested in deterrence through terror. The short process became the standard. If a soldier was brought in with a suspicious wound, the trial often lasted less than an hour. The judges were frequently senior officers with no legal training, driven by the fanatical belief that any man not willing to die for the Führer was a parasite. In several documented cases during the retreat through Poland, soldiers were executed while still on stretchers, their bandages still wet with the blood of their self-inflicted wounds. The executioners were often ordered to shoot the men in the chest, leaving the cowardly wound intact as a grisly warning to the rest of the battalion. The breaking point for the military justice system came with the realization that even the threat of death was losing its power. For a soldier in a cauldron like the Cherkasy Pocket, the chance of surviving the front was nearly zero. A firing squad offered a 100% chance of death, but a home shot offered at least a small chance of a sympathetic doctor or a chaotic evacuation. The soldiers were playing a mathematical game against death. In the final months of 1944, the regime's desperation led to the ultimate escalation: Sippenhaft, or kin liability. If a soldier was convicted of self-mutilation or desertion, his family back in Germany could be arrested, their rations cut, or sent to concentration camps. The state had effectively taken the soldier's wife and children hostage to ensure he kept his body in the line of fire. This was the decisive breakthrough of the state's cruelty. It moved the home shot from an act of personal survival to an act of familial betrayal. The individual's rebellion was crushed under the weight of collective punishment. The cessation of hostilities in May 1945 did not bring an immediate end to the story. Instead, it revealed the staggering scale of the phenomenon and the sheer brutality of the Nazi response. While exact figures remain elusive due to the systematic destruction of records, historians estimate that tens of thousands of German soldiers were executed for military subversion, a category that heavily featured self-mutilation. In the cold arithmetic of the home shot, by 1945, the German military justice system had handed down approximately 30,000 death sentences to its own men. This figure dwarfs the combined executions of the British, American, and French armies by a factor of nearly 100. A significant portion of these were men whose wounds were judged to be acts of sabotage. For those who were not executed, the psychological and physical consequences were permanent. The survivors of the penal units returned from the front, if they returned at all, as broken men. Many were missing limbs not from the home shot itself, but from the punishment that followed. They were the walking ghosts of a collapsed empire. Their wounds were a double-edged sword. They had survived the war, but they carried the physical evidence of their dishonour into a post-war world that had no room for their complexity. The question was always there, unspoken. Was it a Russian bullet or your own? The strategic consequence for the Wehrmacht was the total erosion of trust between the officer corps and the rank and file. By weaponizing the medical system, the High Command had turned healers into hunters. This fractured the camaraderie that the German army had long touted as its greatest strength. By 1945, the German soldier was fighting in a state of total isolation, distrustful of his leaders, fearful of his doctors, and hunted by his own military police. The broader consequences of the home shot epidemic rippled far beyond the immediate casualty lists. In the years following 1945, the divided Germanys struggled with how to classify these men. In the West, the self-mutilators were often still viewed through a lens of cowardice or lack of character. It took decades for the legal system to recognise that these acts were often the only possible form of resistance against a genocidal regime. In the East, the German Democratic Republic attempted to frame these soldiers as anti-fascist resistors, though the reality was far more nuanced. Most were not political activists. They were simply human beings at the end of their tether. This period saw a massive shift in military doctrine worldwide. The German experience served as a grim case study on the limits of hardness. It proved that a military justice system based solely on terror eventually hits a point of diminishing returns, where the soldier fears his own side more than the enemy, leading to a total collapse of unit cohesion. Technologically, the forensic methods developed to detect self-mutilation laid the groundwork for modern ballistics and wound pathology. But the true legacy was human. The home shot remained a family secret for thousands of German households. Grandfathers who walked with a limp or hid a scarred hand never told the story of the dugout, the cleaning rag, and the Mauser. They carried the secret of their survival as a burden of shame, a final victory of the Nazi state's propaganda, which had branded the instinct to live as a crime against the race. The war ended in 1945, but for the men who chose to wound themselves, the war of silence lasted a lifetime. The story of the Heimatschuss is more than a footnote in military history. It is a profound testament to the breaking point of the human condition. It reveals a fundamental truth about war, that there is a limit to what any ideology, no matter how fanatical, can demand of the individual. When the German soldier turned his weapon upon himself, he was engaging in a final, desperate act of reclamation. In a system that viewed his body as a mere cog in a machine of conquest, his wound was a declaration that his life still belonged to him, even if the price was a lifetime of shame or a moment before a firing squad. This dark chapter of World War II forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of courage and cowardice. We often view history through the lens of grand strategy and heroic sacrifice, but the home shot reminds us of the quiet, lonely terrors of the individual. It shows us that when a state replaces justice with terror and medicine with forensics, it loses the very soul of the men it seeks to command. The scars carried by these soldiers, both the physical marks on their limbs and the psychological weight of their choices, serve as a permanent memorial to the tragedy of total war. They remind us that under the weight of an unbearable reality, the instinct to survive is not a failing of character, but the most fundamental expression of our humanity. The home shot was not just a ticket home, it was a scream for mercy in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. As the last veterans of that era pass away, their silence remains a powerful warning about the cost of a society that values the strength of the state over the sanctity of the person.